Hello everyone, good evening. I'm Ros Franklin, the owner and director of Amalgamate, and I'm thrilled to be your host and speaker for tonight's webinar, What to Expect When the Dental Board Inspects, 5 items you should have ready now. And before we get started, and as you've probably worked out, everyone's microphones and videos are switched off to minimize background noise and distractions. Don't worry, you can still participate by typing your questions into the chat function, and I'll do my best to answer them during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you prefer, though, to ask your questions out loud, I'm happy to enable your audio during the Q&A time. Also, the webinar is being recorded and will be emailed tomorrow to all who've registered for the webinar. Now, before we dive into the webinar topic, I thought I'd share a bit about myself. I graduated from the University of Western Australia back in 1994 and worked as a dentist in both private and government practices for about 15 years. You might hear a bit of an accent, and that's because I spent most of my childhood not in Canberra, where I was born, but in America due to my father's work. I made the decision to go to university in Australia, and I ended up in Perth. After finishing university, I worked in Kalgoorlie and then Bunbury, where I still live. After 15 years or so of practicing, I decided to have a change of direction, and I spent 3 years teaching dental assistants and writing educational materials for their courses. And next, I was asked to help a colleague's dental practice become accredited. One thing led to another, and I started Amalgamate, initially to work with practices wanting to become accredited. But I soon realised there was a greater need for infection prevention and control education and training in dental practices, and my knowledge was lacking as well. So I went back to university to complete a graduate certificate in infection prevention and control at Griffith University. I continue to maintain my registration as a dentist with the Dental Board of Australia and continue to be a member of the Australian Dental Association. I've also been involved with the Australasian College for Infection Prevention and Control for the past 4 to 5 years on a couple of committees tasked with credentialing members and organising their annual conference. Now, over the past couple of years, I've assisted a number of dental practitioners who have had infection control complaints, and I've also audited for the Dental Board of Australia in the area of infection control. So my aim tonight is to provide you with some guidance and support from my learnings. So let's get started with tonight's webinar. Well, as you know, tonight I'm going to discuss 5 key items that you should have ready now to help you be prepared for a possible infection prevention and control inspection. Secondly, I want to touch on how I can help you if you're feeling overwhelmed and want assistance. And finally, going to have a live Q&A where I will do my best to answer your questions. Now, we're all familiar with the term infection control and infection prevention and control, but to make sure we're all on the same page, I think a definition is in order. In dentistry, infection prevention and control is a set of work practices that are designed to prevent or minimize the risk of the spread of infectious diseases among patients, dental healthcare workers, and the community. And these work practices include, for example, proper hand hygiene, the use of personal protective equipment, use of aseptic technique, managing our sharps correctly, and cleaning and sterilisation of our dental instruments. Now, for the duration of this webinar, rather than always saying infection, prevention, and control, I'm just going to shorten it to infection control. Now, I'd like to conduct a poll to get a better understanding of how you're currently feeling about infection control compliance. Now, the poll question will appear on your screen shortly and really appreciate your participation. I'll get the poll going and hopefully this will work. There we go. The question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident do you feel about the infection prevention and control measures in your dental practice? Now, there's 5 answer options. You can definitely choose more than one answer. Not a problem. We'll give that a chance to see if anyone would like to participate in that for me. So what I'm doing at the moment is watching on my screen. I get your little results as they come in. It's kind of neat to see little bars changing. So at the moment, I've got 67% of you who are somewhat confident, which is great, and 33% are kind of neutral. Anyone else like to have a go? Please put it in. I'll just hang on for a few more minutes. Great. Well, it seems to be somewhat confident is the majority of people, so that's really nice to hear. I think most people I've encountered are somewhat confident, but there's always a few of those questions or those little bits you're unsure of, and you just need a bit of clarification or you think, yeah, I'm doing most things right. Can I just check? So might go through a bit of that tonight, and hopefully I'll answer some of your questions. Thanks very much, guys, for participating in that poll. So let's move on to a scenario. Meet Dr. Tooth, very original name, a registered dental practitioner who has recently received a letter from the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, or AHPRA. Now, AHPRA receives and manages notifications about registered health practitioners or students on behalf of the Dental Board of Australia. Now, the letter states that AHPRA has received a notification about Dr. Tooth's performance. And now AHPRA is requesting that Dr. Tooth provide a written response to their letter as quickly as possible, which will then be presented to the Dental Board of Australia. Specifically, Dr. Tooth has been asked to provide or asked to address 5 items on the list provided by AHPRA. Excuse me. These items are all about infection control work practices. So in short, Dr. Tooth needs to provide the following. Item number 1, please provide current photos and or videos of the sterilisation room showing the complete layout and all equipment. So AHPRA wants to see pictures or videos of the sterilisation room to make sure that the layout and equipment are suitable for the cleaning and sterilisation of instruments. This will probably include ensuring that the room is clean, free of unnecessary clutter, that there is a correct workflow of reprocessing instruments from dirty to clean, and that the appropriate equipment is being used. By providing current photos or videos, AHPRA is looking to ensure that the sterilisation room meets all applicable current standards, guidelines, and best practice. The key takeaway here is that while it may seem daunting to provide current photos or videos, it's important to note that a dental practice should always be prepared to show off their sterilising room at any time. By doing so, you can demonstrate your commitment to maintaining a safe and healthy environment for everyone who visits. As you consider Dr. Tooth's scenario, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on your own sterilising room. Are you confident it'll pass muster? Item number 2, please provide 2 weeks of steam steriliser, autoclave cycle data, and corresponding monitoring records for every steam steriliser. Steam sterilisers, also known as autoclaves, are an essential part of infection control work practices in dental practices. As you know, they are used to sterilize instruments and equipment, and it's important they are working correctly. Now, there's two parts to this item. The first part asks for cycle data. Depending on the make, the model, and the age of the steam sterilizer, there are various ways that cycle data is captured. This might be via a printer, a data logger. Is it downloadable onto a USB, or is it done through an Ethernet or Wi-Fi system? The key takeaway here is to ensure that you understand how your steam sterilizer records cycle data and be able to provide that information easily. I'll just pause here for a minute in case anyone's taking notes or quickly taking photos. All right, let's move on. The second part of item 2 asks Dr. 2 for the corresponding monitoring records for every steam sterilizer. Now, these records are kept in a logbook, and they include information about every sterilizer cycle, from the name of the person who turned the cycle on, a description of the instruments that'll be inside, the confirmation of a change of the chemical indicators, the condition of the load upon completion, to the person who is actually releasing or maybe failing the load. These are records that show sterilizers are being monitored properly and that any issues with sterilization can be identified and addressed quickly. The key takeaway is that every sterilizer must have a corresponding logbook. Now, you can choose to keep this in a paper form or an electronic form. You can choose to develop your own recording system or purchase software. As you consider the importance of autoclaves in infection control, it's also worth taking a moment to think about your own autoclave cycle data and the monitoring records. Are you confident that your autoclave is functioning correctly and that your records are complete? If you want to double check, there's a QR code on this slide which will take you to the RACGP Infection Prevention and Control Guidelines, which were recently released, and they've got a really good summary of the information that is required to put in your sterilizing paper or electronic logs. So yeah, that's one thing I think worth having a look at. Let's move on to item 3. Please provide the latest servicing and validation reports for all steam sterilizers. Now, your servicing and validation reports are important documents that show that the steam sterilizers have been properly maintained and they're functioning correctly. And the key takeaway is to ensure that all sterilizers are serviced and validated every year or annually. I recommend that you keep all records of servicing and validation together with your sterilizer logbooks. And remember to treat these as medical records, so please retain them for the required period in accordance with your state or territory regulations. And that's usually around 7 years. Let's move on to item 4. Please provide an overview of the infection control practices you implement in your dental practice. This is a big item. This is asking for quite a bit. And the key takeaway here is basically the dental practice needs to have a written infection control program that is current and it's not out of date. And the important term here is written or documented. Now, a practice infection control program looks at the assessment and management of infection risk and then develops their own infection control policies and procedures for the practice in response to what you've identified as risks. And in addition, the program should have built-in training and education for all dental healthcare workers about infection control procedures and then how their competence will be assessed. How you choose to document your infection control program, it's up to you. It can be in hard copy, it can be in electronic, it can be both. It is a large task to develop and document an infection control program, but there are resources out there to help you. And here are some resources. An infection control program must be supported by up-to-date evidence and the latest guidelines and standards. So the Dental Board of Australia's website has a list of resources for you under their tab Policies, Codes, Guidelines and Frequently Asked Questions. There is also a self-reflective infection control tool, right? So this is a resource, it's a checklist, and it consists of a series of questions and it prompts, and you use it to reflect on your current infection control processes and then see where the gaps are, where you need to improve. And this tool will cover a range of topics from hand hygiene, personal protective equipment, environmental cleaning, instrument sterilisation. It takes a good couple of hours at least to go through this document. So when you do sit down to do it, you might do it in bits or you might do it all at once, depending on how quick you want to do it. And keep a copy of that. That can be part of your infection control training, continuous improvement, that big word. So keep copies of all these self-reflective or checklists that you use. And let's move on to the last item, number 5. Please outline your evidence that the practitioner and all relevant staff have access to all your infection control program documentation and have been trained appropriately. Now, this item 5 ties in with the previous item. And as I mentioned before, documentation related to infection control practices is so important. It provides all the dental healthcare workers with the information to implement infection control measures correctly. Now, it's really critical that you ensure that you have documented evidence that all dental care health workers have been granted access to this program and have undergone training and assessment for competency. That is your key takeaway. Now, if you're still feeling overwhelmed when it comes to infection control and infection control programs, I'm here to help. This is something I absolutely love doing. And I have a feeling that some of the words or topics I've mentioned tonight might have you a bit bamboozled, or maybe you feel I've been talking gobbledygook. Understand where you're coming from. I remember feeling the exact same way. And one way I can help you is I have a new online course that introduces you to the fundamentals of infection prevention and control, including personal safety, dental surgery rooms and steri rooms. Now, the course is broken down into 6 modules, each with an optional quiz to test your knowledge. It starts with a brief welcome, and then the first module is a comprehensive 1-hour lesson on infection control fundamentals. And the remaining modules cover personal safety, dental surgery rooms, and steri rooms. Now, I understand everyone learns at their own pace, which is why access to this course is available for up to a year. And this means you can watch and review the content as many times as you need to fully understand these concepts and feel more confident in your infection control knowledge. And upon completion of the course, you will receive a certificate of completion. And you can use that to demonstrate your commitment to safety and best practice. Now, your investment at the moment for this course is $297, which includes GST. It's an introductory ADX special, and it's available till the 21st of April. If that's not quite what you're after, I also offer a variety of one-off and ongoing infection control support, ranging from one-on-one sessions in person or online, so you can just ask me a ream of questions, to setting up new or existing practice infection control programs, to on-site workshops and audits. Can even help you with dental practice accreditation assistance. please head to my website to find out more. Now, the final slide, just before we launch into the Q&A, if there are any questions, this is just a list of the references that I used for tonight's webinar. One thing I did want to mention is one of the main references is an Australian New Zealand standard, and that's written here as number 1. But this particular standard and another sort of almost similar standard, which is used in hospitals for instrument reprocessing, will soon be replaced by a brand new standard. It has a new number and a new name, which I've written there. At the moment, all we've been told is it is this year. Yes, so once that's out, I'll read it for you and let my clients know what, if anything, has to change. So I'd like to move to the Q&A session. So I'm more than happy to answer your questions if I can. Please feel free to pop any questions in the chat. And if you would prefer to perhaps ask a question rather than type it in, please let me know by raising your hand and I can enable your microphone. So are there any questions at all? Probably help if I actually turned my chat on. Now you're probably all sitting there going, oh my God, she's talked some foreign language to me. And I can understand often the questions come to you later. So of course, if there's any questions later on, I'd be more than happy if you shoot me a quick email and I'll see if I can answer that for you, point you in the right direction. So it doesn't look like, one question. Hi, Roz. How do we go with non-qualified staff? Right, non-qualified staff. You're probably talking about dental assistants. At the moment, dental assistants are not required to be qualified, but or hold a certificate 3 or 4 in private practice. If you work in the government, I believe that's a requirement to have a certificate 3 or possibly the 4. But in private practice, there's no mandatory thing saying, yes, they must be qualified. So what happens there is you tend to train on the job. You might want to put them through a traineeship, but you still have to make sure that the staff you've hired are taught, are trained, and you assess their, how well they're doing for the job that they're doing. You can't just throw them in and go, here you go, clean those instruments. There are so many more steps in the stereo room that have to be done properly for the sterilization of instruments to actually work properly at the end. It's a real shame because I know dental assistants used to be called dental nurses and they were registered, and there was an empowerment or pride in being a dental nurse. And unfortunately, that has changed. And I know a number of dental nurses who've come out from the UK where they have to be qualified, they have to do CPD, and they're incredible team members. Yes, so I would love to see that come back. But at the moment, I think with staff shortages, yeah, it's hard. Yeah, as you said, Karen, DAs are just getting so hard to get. It's almost who you can. But is that a reflection of, this might get into a minefield, is that a reflection on the way they're paid, the way they're treated, maybe the way they're valued? I do know some practices who hang on to staff well. Yeah, they you sort of perhaps want to emulate what they're doing. Yeah. It's not reflected in any, so the accreditation standards, Karen, at the moment, private dental practices, if you're an accredited practice, you're version 1 of the NSQHS, can't remember the acronym standards. They don't actually require staff to be qualified per se, but you have to train your staff, make sure they're competent, but it comes down to work health and safety. Yes, it's a really hard one. It's a really hard one. I hope that answered a bit of your question. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask? Just keeping an eye on the chat in case there's anyone else. No one else wishes to ask question or raise your hand at all? Yeah, probably some of the other observations that I've made that with the 5 items that I've given you tonight, they're quite there's quite the big one about having an infection control program, but then I've also brought in a few things about sterilizers and recording and cycle data. And that's really, really important because the data can also tell you if your sterilizers are working properly. And this is an expensive machine that is in a dental practice, and you need staff to have a basic understanding of how to use this machine, how to test that it's working, how to run it properly, how to put the instruments in properly. There's quite a bit involved. I am currently developing another online course for the stereo room for autoclaves, just sort of some basic how the autoclave works, like going back to primary school physics, and just some general knowledge so that there's more understanding as to why you run the certain tests, like why you might do a helix test or a vacuum test, and why you load a certain way, or you don't shove everything in that autoclave. There's, it only takes so many before it's full. So there's something I'm developing there as well, because I've seen that's a huge area that needs a bit of education as well. Yeah. Anyone have any further questions? I certainly have the time. My presentation wasn't hugely long, so I did want to leave some time for any more questions, but seems like no one else has anything that they want to ask, particularly for tonight. That's okay. Well, I might call it then. So that was brief, but hopefully informative. It's given you something to think about. You will get the recording, as I said, tomorrow, so you can click on those QR codes if you want to start investigating. Yeah, and as I said, I do offer services if you're getting stuck, have questions. I've done all sorts of different things. I visited a practice for 3 hours, someone who's starting up, and she just wanted to spend 3 hours of my time getting me to explain everything in the stereo room and what records. And for her, that was a really good use of her time to get all the information that she wanted. And other people might get me to come in and actually audit and sit down and train and redo things. So anything along those lines, yes, let me know. Hang on. Sorry, that came through a bit later. Batch control software, is there? So Karen's asked another question about batch control software. Is that enough evidence? Okay. So when it comes to batch control, all right, at the moment, under the Australian Standard 4815, we are required to put all the items that we deem critical. So these are items that are used in oral surgery endodontics. They basically go under the gum and into bone. So those instruments we have to make sure stay pouched or wrapped until we're just about to use them. So they're sterile at the point of use. And we also need to put a batch label or a label on them, which tells us what date they were sterilized, what sterilizer they came from, because some practices have more than one. So you might say sterilizer 1, sterilizer 2, and then the cycle number, which every cycle that runs through a sterilizer has its own individual ID cycle number. Now, there are some add-ons. I know Dental for Windows has a Steri module, and a few other companies as well. But quite often they don't capture all that data that you need. You often have to do a few workarounds, particularly if you want to put in your helix test results, your vacuum test results. If you have an ultrasonic and you've done its test in the morning to make sure it's working properly, or washer disinfector soil tests, they often don't encompass all of those. There are a couple of Australian companies who have sterilization tracking software, which does encompass everything. I've put those on my website on my resources section. I've known practices who are using both. They're absolutely excellent. And just to say, I've got no affiliation with those companies at all. I just try to find out what's out there. So your batch control software is evidence. I'm thinking you're probably talking about that's capturing all your cycle data and all your records, and it's all in the one place. Yes, as long as it covers everything, that should be enough. Right, any other questions at all? I can't see anyone typing at the moment, but just in case someone's had a last minute thought, they peer at the chat bar here. No, cool. Give yourself a bit of time when you delve into these resources too. There's a lot of them, and some of them are easier reading than others. Some have pictures, some don't. And sometimes it takes a while to get used to this terminology that's being used. I personally remember I took a while. I'd have to reread paragraphs. I know in the latest ADA infection control guidelines, I've often had to reread paragraphs or make notes or the standards that I've read. So yeah, take your time. You know where to come if you're having any trouble. Lovely. Thank you, Kay, very much. Looks like we might have one more person typing. I'll just wait. Right. We'll call it there. Thank you, Estella, for your very kind comments. I look forward to working with you again as well. Thanks very much. You're up late tonight. All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming along tonight. Please look at the recording when it comes tomorrow, and I look forward to perhaps meeting you all one day. Good night, everyone.